Hi, everybody. My name is Monique Flash, and I'm from the Glenview Public Library, and I'd like to welcome you here today. In a few moments, we'll get started as everybody logs on. But we are here today for Glenview Reads Together, our Community Reads program. And tonight we are going to be in conversation with William Kent Krueger, who is the author of the book we're reading this year, This Tender Land. And in a few moments, we'll get ourselves started as more people log on. We also have various book discussions. So if you have not picked up a brochure in the library telling you more information about the book, there's also a handy dandy bookmark that tells you the book discussions. There's 3 coming up. The first one is September 24th. All of them are going to be via Zoom, of course, at this time. And the various dates and hours are listed on there. For those just joining us, I'd like to welcome you to Glenview Reads Together. And tonight we're going to have our interview with William Kent Krueger for his book, This Tender Land. In a few moments, we'll get going. You can also, we're going to be trying to do some question and answers, which for participants is going to be at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And if you hover over it with your mouse, you can see Q&A. We will try to get to them. There's no promises, but hopefully we can at the end of the main discussion. If you would like to purchase a copy of his book, we have an arrangement with the Book Bin in Northbrook, and they will have signed book plates copies for you. We have a link, I believe, on our website and definitely on the event information, but you can also give them a call tomorrow morning and order a book. And it's great that they're doing that with us for this occasion. And let's see, I'm going to give a little introduction, and then we're going to have Mr. Krueger come on, and we will have a great discussion. So welcome all. So first, let me give you a little introduction on his background. Raised in the Cascade Mountains of Oregon, William Kent Krueger briefly attended Stanford University before being kicked out for radical activities. After that, he logged timber, worked construction, tried his hand at freelance journalism, and eventually ended up researching child development at the University of Minnesota. He currently makes his living as a full-time author. He's been married for over 40 years to a marvelous woman who's a retired attorney, and they make their home in St. Paul. Krueger also writes a mystery series set in the North Woods of Minnesota. His protagonist is Cork O'Connor, the former sheriff of Terramack County and a man of mixed heritage, part Irish and part OBJ. His work has received a number of awards, including the Minnesota Book Award, the Loft McKnight Fiction Award, the Anthony Award, the Barry Award, the Dilys Award, and the Friends of American Writers Prize. His last 9 novels were all New York Times bestsellers, and I think this one is included. Ordinary Grace, his first standalone novel, was published in 2013 and received the Edgar Award, which was given by the Mystery Writers of America. This is his second novel, This Tender Land, and it was published in September 2019. It's the story of 4 orphans who travel the Mississippi River on a life-changing odyssey during the Great Depression. I'd like you all to meet William Kent Krueger.
Hello.
Hi. Hi,
Boy,
welcome.
I'm on my screen today.
So we can get our conversation started and start going into some questions. But first, would you like to read a bit from your novel? Whatever your favorite passages?
I will read the prologue from the novel. When I'm asked to read, I read the prologue for 2 reasons. One is very short. It's just over a minute long. But the other reason I like to read the prologue is I just really love this prologue. So this is how I bring readers into This Tender Land. In the beginning, after he labored over the heavens and the earth, the light and the dark, the land and sea, and all living things that dwell therein. After he created man and woman, and before he rested, I believe God gave us one final gift. Lest we forget the divine source of all that beauty, he gave us stories. I am a storyteller. I live in a house in the shade of a sycamore tree on the banks of the Gilead River. My great-grandchildren, when they visit me here, call me old. Old is a cliche, I tell them with mock disappointment, a terrible trivializing, an insult. I was born along with the sun and earth and moon and planets and all the stars. Every atom of my being was there at the very beginning. You're a liar, they scowl but playfully. Not a liar, a storyteller, I remind them. Then tell us a story, they plead. I need no goading. Stories are the sweet fruit of my existence, and I share them gladly. The events I'm about to share with you began on the banks of the Gilead. Even if you grew up in the heartland, you may not remember these things. What happened in the summer of 1932 is most important to those who experienced it, and there are not many of us left. The Gilead is a lovely river, lined with cottonwoods already ancient when I was a boy. Things were different then. Not simpler or better, just different. We didn't travel the way we do now. And for most folks in Fremont County, Minnesota, the world was limited to the piece of it they could see before the horizon cut off the land. They wouldn't have understood any more than I did that if you kill a man, you are changed forever. If that man comes back to life, you are transformed. I have witnessed this and other miracles with my own eyes. So among the many pieces of wisdom life has offered me over all these years is this: open yourself to every possibility, for there is nothing your heart can imagine that is not so. The tale I'm going to tell is of a summer long ago, of killing and kidnapping and children pursued by demons of 1,000 names. There will be courage in this story and cowardice. There will be love and betrayal. And of course, there will be hope. In the end, isn't that what every good story is about?
Thank you for that. So have you ever thought of doing your own audiobooks?
You know, I auditioned once and they turned me down.
Oh, that's funny. Because you read that, I mean, obviously it's your own words, but you read that very well. And it's coming from the perspective, we should tell readers, of the older version of one of the characters in the book, to set you up. And actually, I went back to look at it a couple times to make sure that I wanted to make sure, I guess, that everything was going to be okay, because that was the now versus the then story that you have going on. How did you get the concept for this latest book? Because you're writing, your regular writing are mysteries set within the deep Minnesota woods, so to speak, and using a cast of characters that you're familiar with. And then this is kind of a little different.
Yes, it is very, very different, but not so different from the first of the standalone novels that I did, a novel called Ordinary Grace, which really opened the door for me to do manuscripts that aren't mysteries. Ordinary Grace has done incredibly well for me, and really allowed me to approach my publisher about other things that might not be my Cork O'Connor series. So actually the idea for this Tender Land I've had since I was 11 years old. When I was 11, in the 5th grade, toward the end of that year, our teacher read to us The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. She did it by reading half an hour after lunch every day. I loved that book. I mean, here was this kid who was just like me, and he was out there on the Mississippi River having these great adventures. And after that, of course, I had to read Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, which I also loved. And honestly, Monique, across my whole career as a writer, I wanted to write a story that would pay homage to Mark Twain, a story that would be in its way an updated version of Tom Sawyer and particularly Huckleberry Finn. And that's where this Tender Land came from.
And it's very interesting. You do have in the back of the book that you traveled a lot of the ground that you are going into. And actually, I was looking at a map this afternoon and trying to figure out where the Minnesota River meets up with the Mississippi and what have you, and try to see what the path was. Did you do that because you knew you were going to be writing this, or was this something that helped with the evolution of the book? Like, I can use this, you know, I'm going to do this for fun, but I could use this for for stuff in the book.
Yeah, I did it after I had actually done a significant portion of the writing of the novel, because I wanted to make sure that what I was writing for the kids on the river felt true. So I needed to know what the kids were experiencing. So my wife and I, well, actually, I canoed a section of the Minnesota, actually kayaked a section of the Minnesota River, that same section that the kids canoe. And then my wife and I together canoed that section of the Mississippi that the kids canoe. So that I could, get a sense of what the rivers were like. What would they see? What would they smell? What are the dangers that they needed to be aware of? So I'm on the Minnesota River. I'm kayaking the Minnesota. I bought a kayak for this. So I'm on the Minnesota River, kayaking the Minnesota
Good excuse to buy one.
Well, I thought I would use it for a lot of other things. So far, I haven't. So I'm in this brand new kayak of mine, kayaking the Minnesota River, and I got my vest on. I'm doing it as safely as I possibly can. But the whole time, the Minnesota River is a treacherous river. There are all kinds of eddies and currents and snags and all kinds of things. And I'm thinking, oh my God, what if I tip over, and what's going to be underneath me? And will I be in a deep hole and drown? Get caught up in snags, whatever. But about the time I'm thinking that, I looked over the edge of the kayak and I saw that the bottom of the river was about this far below my kayak. So I really had nothing to fear, at least at that point. But when my wife and I were on the Mississippi canoeing that section, we happened to be on a day when there were an enormous number of barges. The barge traffic was really heavy. And,
people don't realize how busy it is until you see it. Yeah.
Or how large those wakes are in the, when those huge towboats pass. So there were several times when we were canoeing that we were concerned that we might be swamped. Yeah. Just as I'm sure that Odie and the other vagabonds were concerned.
When you had that section in there, I thought about that because I knew somebody who was doing canoe classes near Grafton, which is right where the Mississippi joins in Illinois. And I was like, oh, I'm not canoeing by big, huge barges. Yeah, because when they get to that section, I'm like, yeah, didn't have that problem upriver. Why did you choose 1932 to set it in? It's very specific. You mention it a lot. I mean, what about the year and that history of the year appealed to you? I mean, you mentioned the Lindenberg kidnapping as kind of to go with the kidnapping that they're accused of. But what else about it made it a good plot point for you?
Well, I knew I wanted to set the story during the Great Depression, because one of the things that I wanted to dig deeply in is the nature of the human heart. Who are we as human beings during periods of great privation? And are we the kind of people who retreat inside ourselves and protect only that which is important to us? Or are we the kind of people who open our arms, and despite how little we might have, we're willing to share it with those who have less? And I couldn't think of a better period of time to set the story in than the Great Depression, a period of terrific privation in our nation and across the world, really. Why 1932? In my research, I saw a number of things that were going on in 1932 that I figured I could use as touchstones for what's happening in the rest of the world as these kids are in Minnesota, having their epic journey. So the Lindbergh kidnapping, which played very nicely into the kidnapping that goes on in the story, the veterans march for their
March on Washington.
On Washington was occurring at that time. So I thought, okay, I can use these kinds of issues and to give it a sense of what's going on is much larger than just what's going on here.
Because I just thought, there's other parts of the 30s that, you could use.
I could.
But it's very interesting that you specifically chose that. So what kind of research, you kind of vaguely mentioned in the back that you were doing research at various historical societies in the areas. So what kind of, I don't know, maybe helped you the most or helped you pinpoint, the 30s is big, huge. What helped you pinpoint and narrow it down for your story that you wanted to include?
Necessarily pinpointing it in 1932, What I needed were all of the factual underpinnings for the Great Depression itself that would help me anchor it in reality for readers. It's really interesting to me. This novel is being called an historical novel. Monique, I was born not very long after the Great Depression ended. I grew up on stories that my folks told about how they survived the Great Depression. But I didn't actually live during the Great Depression, so I definitely needed to do the research to make it feel real. We're fortunate here in Minnesota to have a great historical resource. In St. Paul, we have what's called the Minnesota History Center. And inside the History Center is a section called the Gale Family Library, which, among other things, is essentially an archive of every newspaper ever published in Minnesota.
Nice.
So I spent hours and hours in the Gale Family Library going over microfilmed newspapers from the day, just to try to figure out, okay, what were the important issues of the day, both nationally and here in Minnesota? What were the fashions of the day? What did things cost? All of that, so that I could make the Great Depression as real for the reader as I possibly could. So there was that research going on. Plus I read the Gale Family Library also as a repository of lots of first-person accounts, memoirs by people at various periods of time. So they had lots of memoirs by people who had gone through the Great Depression and written about it, both in the Twin Cities, large urban area, small towns, and on farms. And so I read all of those to get a sense of the different kinds of experiences people would have been having during the Great Depression, depending upon the environment. And I just had a ball and had my eyes opened in so many ways as a result of that experience.
You forget how much you learn from a regular newspaper if it's from a different time.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
You get kind of blasé when you look at modern ones because you're used to all the stuff. But then when you start looking at even the advertisements and what have you, can turn into something.
So enlightening.
Really, they were buying this.
You can read history books, and that's fine. But if you go back and you read what was actually being published in the day, printed in the day, the day-to-day lives, that is so much more revealing.
Did you sneak any family stories in here in little bits and pieces?
From my own family?
Yeah.
I did that with the companion novel, the earlier companion novel, Ordinary Grace, which really was about my family, but I pretty much stayed clear of family stories for this one. This was all from my imagination.
There's kidnapping, there's murder, there's all sorts of stuff going on. So yeah, you don't want anything.
It wasn't part of my growing up experience.
With the family.
Was it yours?
My parents were in the Depression. My father and mother, different households, different incomes, so different experiences. So I grew up on stories with that to an instance. So it was very interesting seeing that time period and realizing what I thought was a cute story was really kind of a hardscrabble existence. So it brought back some of that, especially when they're trying to find food for themselves as they go throughout and fish and what have you and stuff. So yeah, that reminded me a lot of some of that. Go ahead.
Quick note here. My father was from Oklahoma. He's passed. But he grew up during the Depression and during the Dust Bowl years. And I remember stories he told me about watching it rain mud from the sky. And to your point about scrounging for food, I remember his stories about going out and looking for greens, wild greens, to supplement what they had on their table. And do you know, one of the things I have so appreciated after publication of the novel is the number of stories that people have written to me and said, my father told me the stories when he was on the bum during the Great Depression, or my uncle experienced this during the Great Depression, and your story resonated with that. I love hearing those stories.
Yeah, because definitely the traveling down and the fact that they're heading towards Chicago, I was like, yeah, because Chicago, well, we're Chicagoland area here, but Chicago wasn't. I almost felt like saying, Chicago wasn't that great of a place either, but okay, it might be better than where you're at. It's all a matter of degrees. And I think Odie finally realized that when he goes through one of the Hoovervilles and he realizes he still has a lot or, you know, that they have all these things, and especially after there's an incident where the police go through the Hooverville and kind of damage a lot of stuff. And he kind of realizes there are other people who are worse off than he is. And that's also the point of him being 13 years old. Why did you decide to, besides the fact that it's an obvious homage to Huckleberry Finn, why did you decide to make your main characters teenagers and one little girl?
Yeah, well, I made my my narrator, Odie O'Banion, relate the story that occurred in his essentially his 13th year. And the reason is that that narrative voice is very easy for me. And the only explanation I have for that is that I ceased maturing after 13 years. I just stopped right there. You know? In fact, I think most men stop at 13 years of age.
The mindset's always there, huh?
Yeah. But it's in the earlier companion novel, Ordinary Grace, I also used a 13-year-old narrator. And that was such satisfying experience for me that when I began to conceive of this story, I knew that I was going to use that first-person dual narrative voice. For anybody out there who hasn't read This Tender Land, I use a narrative voice that is both from the perspective of the older person telling this story, the older, wiser person, but also then the younger, more naive character at 13 years of age. It's the same technique that Harper Lee used in To Kill a Mockingbird. I just think it's difficult to achieve. You know, you got to pull it off well, so readers don't stumble over it. But it's such a compelling way to tell a story. I have found. So I knew Odie was going to be 13 years old. In my original thinking of the story long ago, as I thought about it over all my years, trying to wrap my thinking around this particular story that I wanted to write, that was going to be an homage in a way to Huckleberry Finn. When Huck Finn goes on his river voyage, his journey, he's accompanied by a runaway slave, Jim. And I knew in my telling it was not going to be Native American or African American. It would be a Native American kid, slightly older than Odie. So I always had those two characters in mind. But as the story began to come to me, and I realized there were so many other things that I want to talk about, I realized that one of them was going to be family. What is it that makes family? Is it blood or is it something else? And so I needed to give Odie a family of sorts. So I gave him an older brother, Albert. Emmy actually came late into my thinking in this story. I had created a little Emmy originally simply to be a daughter for Cora Frost because Cora Frost seemed like the kind of woman who would have a daughter like Emmy. But as I was writing all of those early scenes that in the first part of the book in which Emmy plays a part, I fell in love with little Emmy, as everybody does. And then it came time for the boys to leave the boarding school, to run away from the boarding school. And I thought, oh my God, they're leaving Emmy in a horrible situation. I can't do that to Emmy. She's got to go with them. So I decided at that point that Emmy, okay, she's going to be among the vagabonds who make this journey all together. And that's when I began to conceive of the part Emmy would play and the special talent that Emmy has.
I love Emmy. She's great, and she just comes forward as a younger kid can with just these straight, matter-of-fact stuff, and you're just like, okay, yeah.
She's a wise soul.
Yes, she's a wise soul in a very young body. Question. So with Mose, your Native American character, why did you make the choice to make him mute? But yet, once he learns sign language, Odie constantly refers to his responses as being extremely eloquent and elongated and beautiful. And then, of course, proceeds to give like a shorter narrative of it. But why did you decide to give him a voice but no voice?
Mose is a character that stands for something much larger than himself. He stands for an entire culture that had no voice. Native Americans, the indigenous people on this continent, and probably everywhere where there's been an indigenous people who've been overwhelmed by a larger majority, simply had no voice. from the late 1880s until 1978, when the National Indian Child Welfare Act was passed. If you were a Native family and the government came to you and said, we are going to take your children and we are going to send them to a boarding school hundreds of miles away, you could not prevent that. You had no recourse. You had no say in the matter. You had no voice. And so Mo stands for this culture that is muted by this larger, stifling, often vindictive majority.
How hard was it to research that? Because those are just what you include in your book is so harsh that I don't think most of us can imagine those incidents. And I know you did your research on it. How hard was it to do that?
You know, I've been working because of my Cork O'Connor series. Cork is a man of mixed heritage. He's part Irish and American, and he's part Anishinaabe, Ojibwe. So I have been aware of that tragic period of history, the Native American boarding school experience, for a very long time. But in order to create that section of the book in as realistic a way as possible, I had to dig very deeply into it. And so again, I went to first-person narratives by those survivors of that experience. And the truth, Monique, is that I had to tone down the horrors of that experience. Yeah. Because I was concerned that if I made it as realistic as I possibly could, a reader could not move beyond it. It would turn a reader off. So I toned down the horrors of the experience. But it was for those who, you know, it wasn't always the case. Not every boarding school experience was horrific. But I would say, based on my research, the majority of the experiences were.
Moving on from that.
I just want to say,
go ahead.
One of the things that I'd hoped when I decided I was going to open this story in a Native American boarding school, one of the things that I'd hoped might occur is that I could open the eyes of people who had no idea that this had occurred, particularly white readers. The Native community has been aware of it, although they very often haven't talked about it. But white readers, as a rule, had no idea that this was going on. And so I wanted to enlighten people if I could.
And it does. I think it really does. I think most people haven't explored that part of history or that part of Native American history. And you open with it. So you cannot run away from it because it does affect the rest of the story throughout. I mean, at one point, Odie does, I can't remember exactly where, but he does kind of sit there and go, you know, maybe we should have just gone back. And that's kind of appalling because you're like, oh my gosh, you think it's bad enough now that you want to go back to that. Yeah, no, I caught that one. And I was like, no, you don't want to go back. But Odie seems to have a talent, besides his storytelling, that he unites people with music. Why did you choose to have music be such a big role in their journey, throughout the whole journey? We have hymns, we have folk and pop tunes of the day, and he's performing, and the harmonica is one of the last gifts his father has given him, and he uses it, and it brings people of all ages and types together. That was a choice. Why did you choose to do that?
Absolutely. I knew Odie was going to play two important roles in the story. He was going to be the guy who would keep the vagabonds on the move, keep them going, keep them focused on, we're going to St. Louis. St. Louis is where we're going. And he also was going to be my voice about storytelling. Odie's a storyteller. And so I was able to use Odie to say a lot of things about storytelling that I so deeply believe. But the other important chore for Odie was to keep the spirits up. And I couldn't think of a better way for him to do that than music. You know, music is so important to us as human beings. We fall in love to music. We get married to music. We get buried to music. We march away to war to music. So I knew music was going to be the way. And when I thought about, okay, how is Odie going to do this? What can he take with him on this journey?
It needs to be portable.
It needs to be absolutely. I thought, well, shoot, it's got to be a harmonica. You know, that's so easy to carry with you and so versatile and so American. And then I just had a blast coming up with the tunes that Odie was going to play. And some of them came out of my childhood, some of my favorite American ballads. Some of them came from the research I did about what would be the pop music of the day, Gershwin, Cole Porter, those kinds of things. But I just had an enormous amount of fun with that. And for any listeners out there, you can go to my website and click on the link for This Tender Land. And among the other links associated with that is a Spotify list that has all of the music, all of the cuts of the music that Odie plays on his harmonica, done by musicians in essentially the style that Odie would have been familiar with.
Awesome.
It's
very,
terrific.
very cool. That's very, very cool. No, I caught that, especially when you have Sister Evie singing some hot jazz number of the day after she's had her revival kind of there is pretty funny. I like that a lot. And this goes kind of with the Sister Evie part, and we actually have a question from an audience member at the same time about this. Almost all the characters in here are struggling with faith, faith in themselves, faith in a family or family members, faith in the government, society, and whatever their religion is. Odie's limited experience grows from God as a tornado, which is a very basic destructive level, to seeing Sister Evie's way of praying for forgiveness as a different way of thinking of things. Do you believe that this part of your book is almost an essential part of the hero's / vagabond's journey?
It's definitely an important part of Odie's journey. And if you are familiar with either my Cork O'Connor series or Ordinary Grace, you're going to see that the spiritual journey plays a significant part in so many of the stories that I create, because it's been a significant part of my life. And so entering This Tender Land, I knew that one of the things I wanted to talk about is the spiritual journey, and I would use Odie in that regard. And so we begin with Odie having this very Old Testament image of God, the smiting God, the wrathful God, the tornado God. And the God that Albert offers him. He says, Odie, how does a shepherd eat his flock one by one? And then Odie meets Sister Eve, who offers him an entirely different image of God, a forgiving God, a loving God. And so as Odie is going down the river on his journey, he is trying to put together these conflicting images of God. And, I used Odie to essentially mirror my own spiritual journey. As I go through life, I look at all of the conflicting images of God out there, trying to put together what exactly is the nature of the divine. So I knew that was going to be an important thread. And see, I love the river. I love the river because the river can be a metaphor for so many things. It's certainly a metaphor for Odie in his journey, in his spiritual journey. It's a metaphor for the vagabonds as a family, from their journey as individuals to the creation of a family as a result of all they experience together and the way they care for one another. It's a journey in understanding, from the naivety of Odie and his view of the world, or even Albert for that matter, or Emmy or Mose, to a much broader understanding of the world. It's much larger than anything that they ever saw back in Native American boarding school. And so there are so many journeys going on in this story. I knew it was I wanted to tell a simple story. I wanted the story to be very straightforward. And I wanted its straightforwardness to mask its complexity, because there's an enormous amount going on in this story.
And that was one of the interesting points reading in the back of the book when you talk about your, I'm not saying obsession, but your admiration for Charles Dickens. And I thought to myself, I said, oh yeah, he's got it in here because of all the characters. I like lots of characters, and I thought you came up with some doozies. And I thought that was really interesting, because when you do look at Dickens, you do look at the different situations, and it's the characterizations that draw you in, either to the plot line that goes along through it, or makes you laugh, or makes you cry, various as you go along the storyline. So I really enjoyed that. Ever think of pulling one of these other characters out? And I mean, I know you do a lovely kind of wrap up of everyone's life at the end. We don't want to give anything away for anybody who hasn't read the book. Why haven't you yet? But have you ever thought, going back to this, you know, where's Sister Evie's story? What else has she been doing? Because you've created these and managed to fit them in, these backstories that you've managed to fit in, and not everybody can do that. And makes you want to learn. You're like, I mean, we did a book discussion here at the library, and we were all like, well, we want to know about this one, and we want to know more, you know, what is Emmy doing here? And, you know, what is Sister Evie doing here? And how is that dress shop really going? We really wanted to know some more of the story, so to speak. So have you ever thought about dragging, I mean, if it was a short story, I think people would love it.
And the answer is no. Simply the answer is no. You know,
No.
With the epilogue, as you point out, I pretty much give the reader a solid sense of where everybody ended up, without going too deeply into a lot of the specifics. But mostly I wanted, you know, I fell so in love with the Vagabonds. I didn't want it just to end. I wanted to give readers a sense of, okay, this is where the rest of their journey took them, to these places in their lives. But once I'd done that, I was finished with the Vagabonds. I've told their story. It was time for me
to do something else. So another thing that I noticed in the epilogue, what is your work process like? Because you thanked the Starbucks and the Caribou Coffee groups, because it's obvious you enjoy working with a bit of distraction.
You know, I have always written in coffee shops. I've composed every novel that I've published in a coffee shop.
Wow.
You know, that was a process that began for a very practical reason for me decades and decades ago. We came to Minnesota so that my wife could go to the University of Minnesota Law School. And as soon as she got into law school, I became the sole support of the family. I was the guy who had to keep a roof overhead and food on the table. But I wanted desperately to be a writer. And so if I was going to develop as a writer and still meet my responsibilities as a family man, I had to come up with a way to do that. We were living at that point 2 blocks from this iconic cafe in St. Paul, a place called the St. Clair Broiler, that opened its doors at 6 a.m. every morning, 7 days a week. So I pitched this idea to my wife. I said, Diane, if you're willing to get the kids up in the morning and dressed and fed and off to school so I can go write in that time, I swear to you, when I come home from my job at the end of the day, I will be the best husband, the best father you can possibly imagine. She bought it. So there I was, 8 o'clock every morning at the broiler with my notebook and my pen in hand. Notebook and pen, because this was long before we had laptops. They would sit me down at booth number 4, always booth number 4. They saved it for me. They would pour me my coffee. I would open my notebook, pick up my pen, and from 6 until 7:15, I would write. At 7:15, I closed my notebook, paid for my coffee, and went out front because at 7:20, a bus would pick me up and take me to the university where I was working. So that became my routine, my discipline, my inspiration. I honestly cannot write at home, although I'm doing it now because of the coronavirus. But working at home, it's way too quiet. I love the white noise in a coffee shop. It's a place where I can just really sink myself deeply into my own imagining. You know, when I'm at home and it's really quiet, honest to God, I've had this experience, Monique. I've been at home with house to myself on a winter day. I remember this. On a winter day, snow outside, sun sparkly, all of that stuff that goes along with winter. And it's exactly the kind of environment you would think would be conducive to creative work. And what am I doing? I'm sitting there going, shouldn't the furnace have come on by now? You know, I hear everything. The phone rings, I've got to answer it. Somebody knocks at the door, you know. I walk by the kitchen sink and I'm going, I got to get to those dishes eventually. But in a coffee shop, nothing there is my responsibility. It's all about doing the work.
Somebody else.
I love coffee shops.
So what do you find within that? What do you find the worst part about it being a writer? Obviously, writing by yourself in your house, or what are some of the better parts? Is it the writing itself? and nowadays authors are kind of jack of all trades. You're your own PR department, you're your own get the word out there, and everything else, because you do get some support from publishers, but depending on your publisher, you don't. So what part of the writing process is it, and particularly for this book, you really had to plan and plot this out. Are you a plotter or are you a pantser, so to speak? Then that means seat of the pants writer. Sorry for those who didn't know that.
Well, you've got like 2 or 3 different questions in there.
I know, I threw them all
Let's
at
see
you
if
at
I can
once, I'm
parse
sorry.
this out. So what kind of a writer am I? Depends on what kind of a story I'm writing. When I'm writing a story for the Cork O'Connor series, those are essentially mysteries. And a mystery is an incredibly tightly woven fabric of storytelling. Everything depends so significantly on everything else. And the true value in a story, the greatness of a story in the mystery genre comes from when you do the reveals, when you offer the reader the clues that are going to be essential for solving the puzzle. You can't do it too early, nor can you do it too late. So when I'm writing a story in the Cork O'Connor series, I think those stories through significantly before I ever put my fingers on the keyboard. That idea is usually in my head for several weeks or even several months. And by the end of my thinking process, I know how that story begins, I know how it ends, I know who did what to whom and why, I know the themes I want to weave through the story. But for Ordinary Grace and This Tender Land, my 2 standalones, I followed an entirely different process. I wanted it to be organic. I wanted the stories to reveal themselves to me as I was creating them. And so I only knew a few salient details going into the writing of both of those manuscripts. But I got to tell you, those were 2 of the most extraordinary writing experiences I've ever had. They were so satisfying. And honestly, I felt so often as if the story was being given to me. It was just wonderful. And I hope I have it again down the road sometime.
Hope it doesn't
So
stop.
there's that. Now, in terms of what is the most difficult part of being a writer, it's the business part of being a writer. It's all of the promotional stuff that goes along with being a writer. You know, every writer, before you publish, the idea is that you're going to be isolated, do this piece of work, this wonderful story, you're going to put it out there, and readers are going to beat down the doors of the bookstores, just eager to read your stuff. It's not like that. And although a publisher initially will give you some help in that regard, that doesn't really help. That doesn't really come about significantly until you've kind of established yourself as a writer. So very early on, it's on the shoulders of most writers to do their own promotion. So you create your website, you create your promotional materials. I spent a significant part of my first advance paying for a national tour for myself, which my publisher did not put together. But now that I'm a New York Times bestselling author, they do a lot of stuff for me now that I don't have to do for myself.
It's the overnight success.
There you go.
I always find that really interesting when people are like, oh, this person's new, he's an overnight success. And I'm like, no, he's been in the trenches for quite a while. It's just that the book finally, we knew he was growing. Librarians can sometimes tell that with various different series where you see somebody at an event and you kind of go, keep an eye on this one because this one's going a lot further. And it's fun when it happens because it's kind of like, yeah, we knew they were going to be big. That's why we have all of his books.
Well, I have had support from librarians from the get-go. They've just been wonderful in recommending my work to their readers. And I love librarians.
Well, thank you. We appreciate it. We like library love. We definitely do. I have some more author questions, but I'm having some really very great questions from the audience. I'm going to start including some of those already in here. And you kind of answered this already. For an intricate story like this, with the many threads and the different sectioning, I thought that was really interesting. And then I went and took a peek at the Odyssey and realized it's sectioned off kind of the same way by tale. With many threads, how do you organize the storyboard? Is there a diagram of sorts that guides you through the manuscript writing?
At this point, no. It's all up here. And after 20 years of writing stories and having them published, I can do that fairly well. In the early days, I would actually outline every manuscript, and I did that maybe for the first 7 or 8 manuscripts. I would outline chapter by chapter so that I could see where each chapter was going to take the story forward, how it was going to do that, and keep all of the plot points in my together. But I've been doing this for so long that it kind of works naturally in my brain now. And I trust my storytelling instincts significantly. That's one of the things I've had to learn, is not second guess myself. When an idea comes to me, generally I know, okay, you should run with it, that kind of thing.
Take it and go. This is another question. Your books have always had a spiritual, we kind of touched on this a little bit, have a spiritual quality that the reader tries to see that they will become out actually. Where does this come from in your life or being?
Yeah. Okay, so I have always been on a spiritual journey. I think we're all on a spiritual journey, whether we embrace that or not. So my religious upbringing, my spiritual journey early on was shaped by my religious upbringing, probably the same way most people who are watching this, for them. In my case, I grew up Episcopalian. I was in the Anglican Church. But when I graduated from high school, I thought it was time to put my spiritual journey behind me, as most of us do when we leave home and graduate from high school and go out into the world. I thought, okay, it's time for me to embark on an entirely different kind of journey. I graduated in 1969 into a world that was dominated by three things: sex, drugs, and rock and roll. So I really was ready for a different kind of journey. But then I began to write my stories in the Cork O'Connor series, and the more I wrote those stories, the more I began to see spiritual questions bubble up in the plots that I created. And it helped me to realize that I had not abandoned the spiritual journey. It was there. And so I began to actually embrace it and incorporate it as much as I can in my work. I'm still trying to figure out the whole nature of the spiritual journey. What is it I'm supposed to learn as I'm here in this flesh? And I love writing about it. I love probing that, because there's no concrete answer. There never will be. This is the great mystery.
Totally switched kind of question. Can you talk about the title? Why this tender land? I caught the mention of it, or I believe the mention of it, in one of the individual chapters. And I said, oh, here it is. But why did you pull that out for the title?
I was driving across southern Minnesota one summer afternoon without a title for the manuscript. And I was listening to our public radio, our classic public radio station. And a piece of absolutely stunningly beautiful music came on that I was completely unfamiliar with. And at the end of that piece, the announcer came on and he said, "You've been listening to a section from the only opera Aaron Copland ever composed, titled," and I thought he said, "This Tender Land." The actual title of the opera is The Tender Land. But I heard This Tender Land and I thought, there's my title. I love that. Because for me, it encapsulated the sense of the Midwest that I have. It is a wonderfully tender place. And even though terrible things happen here, we have plagues of locusts and drought and prairie fires and you name it, the land's not to blame. The land is just what it is. The land also gives us a home. It holds us in its hand. It feeds us. So it is a tender land at heart. I like that title.
I just was traveling in Minnesota a couple of years ago, and we went across on our way to South Dakota. And I don't think many people realize, and Illinois is like this as well, where you have your cities, and then you get outside and you have your smaller towns, and then you have your farms.
Yep.
And how much, just going straight across from St. Paul, kind of, I forget what route that is, but hitting Mankato, and how you forget that how much of the state in itself is a farm. I mean, some of it has, when I was reading the book, I was like, I've seen Mankato, I've seen what's outside of Mankato. I said, some of this has not changed. Yeah. It's still small town. It's still farming community. It's still not urban.
Anybody who goes across the heartland on the freeways misses it. You have to take the blue highways, the back roads, and go through the small towns and weave your way through cornfields and soybean fields and these lovely little lost valleys. And if you do that, you can't help but fall in love with the place.
Was there any part of, and I'm gearing towards the flats because I really liked the flats scene, and it's not there anymore, correct? That anyone
Well,
can
the
live
West
on
Side
that?
Flats are still there. It doesn't exist in the way it did back in 1932.
Because that sounded like a fun place to visit.
You know, it was an interesting. I didn't know about the West Side Flats until I knew that I wanted the kids to be in St. Paul for a period of time, but I wasn't sure exactly how I was going to accomplish that. And so I began reading up on the history and stumbled across the West Side Flats. And it had such a rich, interesting history that really, in its way, fed so well into the story of the vagabonds that I thought, okay, this is what I'm going to use. But you know, the West Side Flats was the place where the early immigrant population first settled because it got flooded every year. Nobody else wanted
To live there.
And so really the Eastern European Jewish population was significant. But that changed over time. And finally in the 1960s, they raised the West Side Flats, built a levee to keep the flooding out and turned it into other kind of buildings, housing.
It's too bad. It sounded like a fun place.
Well, I had a lot of fun walking the West Side Flats to this today and imagining where Gertie's place would have been in the boat works and, you know, all of that, where Shlomo lived.
Because all the characters really do come alive in that section, I thought. And I really enjoyed that. Let me see if we have anything else. We do have a comment that the pace of the book for this particular reader for 95% unfolds gently as a nice pace for the reader. And then he felt that the ending was too abrupt. Why did you shift the pace?
Because things happen. Knots are, loose ends are knotted up, tied up. And there wasn't any way to extend that I could see. Once Odie embarks for St. Louis on his own, then the answers lie there before him. And once he knows the answers, there's no point in.
And it's almost like once he's, and part of it too is he's on the rails now. So it is a faster pace. It kind of gets that, you know, the river is languid. Okay, we got to wait and go with the river. But now he's on the rails. It is going to be faster. He's going into the city.
Well, thank you. I like that.
Yeah.
There you go. Whoever asked that, there you go.
Because, I mean, he gets there a lot faster because I was looking at the breakout of the book and I'm just like, if they're going down the whole Mississippi, this is going to take a while.
Yeah.
Because St. Louis is a lot further down than you think. They still have to go past Iowa. Yeah, so that I found real interesting that you did switch them and with the help of John Kelly to get on the rails and have that experience of the Depression as well. Because it's mentioned, I think he mentions it before when they're going under a bridge and he sees the people traveling. I mean, that was a big part of how people got around because like the one family in the book, they didn't have the cars, they didn't have the money for the cars. They were, and especially men, young men or older men looking for work, were going on the rails and getting chased off too.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a dangerous thing to do. So yeah, the pace is a bit on the languid side as they're going down the rivers. Then, as you point out, when Odie hits the rails, things speed up because Odie's going toward the answers that he's been seeking all his life, really.
He finds out more about himself.
Yeah, I actually rewrote the last section, revised the last section of the novel more than any other section, because when Odie gets to St. Louis, the answers come to him fairly quickly, and they are rather unusual twists and turns. And I wanted to write it in such a way that a reader wouldn't roll his or her eyes and go, "Oh, give me a break." It needed to feel like, "Oh, I see." You know, I wanted them to go back. I see the seed was there, and the seed was there, and the seed was there.
I like how you put that, the seed, because you realize, I'm trying to do this without giving away any plot points. I'm sorry, readers who haven't read it yet. You kind of realize that it's all a circle, and it begins from the one
All
point.
connected.
And it's
You don't
all
know it
connected.
until the very end. It's all connected.
It's all connected in the end. And there was, meaning is maybe not the word for it, but there was a sense of joining and connectivity throughout the whole thing. I guess that's the best word for it. I can't think of another one. So that was kind of interesting at the end there. I'm sorry, readers who haven't read it yet, you need to get your copy. We have some at the library.
Spoilers.
We're trying not to do any spoilers. Because somebody had a question earlier, and I'm like, I can't do that. That's a spoiler question. Let me see here. So, I mean, you talk about Dickens in the back. I mean, you give us a lot of secrets in the back about yourself, about your writing process. You talk about Dickens. It's obviously you've given him Odysseus as a name. Very classic, and the classic journey and the classic adventures as he goes throughout. And I always thought it was really interesting for music-wise, and especially you don't necessarily have a siren, but I guess Macbeth can be considered a siren of sorts.
Macbeth is Calypso. If you're looking for the counterpart in the Odyssey, she's
okay.
Calypso. In the Odyssey, Calypso falls deeply in love with Odysseus, and he falls deeply in love with her, and she almost seduces him away from his journey home, as Macbeth almost does with him.
That's perfect. That's perfect. So who else are your writing heroes?
I just want to point out one more literary influence in this novel that I was totally unaware of, but readers continue to point it out to me. So I acknowledge my appreciation, admiration for Dickens, for Homer, for Mark Twain, but there was another writer who, as I look at this story now, I can't believe I missed it, but is certainly influential in the story, and that's Frank L. Baum, The Wizard of Oz.
Oh, yeah.
I look at the story now and I go, of course, you've got the Black Witch, you've got the tornado, you've got these characters on a journey, each of them searching for something they don't have. And I'm going, how did I miss that?
Instead of the shoes, you have the magic harmonica.
There we go.
There we go. Yeah, that's perfect. And if anyone's read the original and not just seen the movie, it's a lot grittier than you would think.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's interesting that readers are pointing out to you instead of, because he was a Midwesterner.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So he knew what he was talking about on the fields of Kansas.
Anymore, Toto.
Yeah, that's interesting. So what about living authors as opposed to ones that are no longer with us?
You know,
who are you?
I greatly admire other Midwest authors, and because I can relate to their love of the land. I think you can make a case that there is in fact a Midwest voice in literature. It's very spare, but I think very eloquent, and rises significantly out of an understanding of our relationship with this land we occupy here in the Midwest. We take great pride in believing that we shape the land, but in truth, the land also shapes us. So among the writers that I admire are Marilyn Robinson. She writes out of Iowa. Her novel Gilead several years ago, Book Award. Most recent, I think, is Lila. There's a guy I consider Midwestern, although he's a little outside it. A fine writer named Kent Haruf, Haruf, who set his work on the plains of eastern Colorado, but it feels so Midwestern because it's rural, small town, agricultural area. Very wonderfully simple stories with such eloquence in how they illuminate the human experience. Here in Minnesota, we have a guy named John Hassler. He was the first Minnesota author I ever discovered. And although he passed away many, many years ago, I continue to go back to his work periodically. Those are just a few.
This one I always like to ask, and I blame Lee Child for this because he was on a panel and he went along with it, and it was great to hear what is on your reading table, or what are you reading next at home. And it doesn't necessarily have to be mystery. or anything else. It can be any author. What are you looking forward to that's coming out if you don't have anything currently on your TBR pile?
Well, I have a number of novels. Actually, I have what are called ARCs on my bedside. ARCs are, for those of you who don't know, is an advanced reader's copy. Or I have bound galleys as well. And these are of books that won't be available for readers to buy for many more months, maybe because of the coronavirus, even
Maybe a
longer.
year.
But I've been asked to read them with an eye to offering a dust jacket quote, what in the business we call a blurb. So, you've seen on the front of a dust jacket, Stephen King says, this is the best thing since the Bible. Yeah. So when I broke into the business as a young writer, more established writers were willing to read my work and offer dust jacket quotes. So it's a way that I pay back. So I've read several, so I'm always reading ARCs. I'm currently reading a book called The Family Ship, which is about a family who has a ship in their backyard. And it is a metaphor for what holds them together. And ultimately, as ships do at sea, this ship founders, this family founders. And it's the story of what holds them together in the end. And I'm just enjoying it immensely. But you probably won't see that until next year. I recently read a book. Oh God, now I'm blanking on the title. That's it. That's it for right now.
We'll take that. We'll write that down.
I will tell you the novel I read this year that just knocked my socks off, surprised the hell out of me. Loved it immensely. I have a friend who writes mysteries. Her name is Cara Black. She is best known as the author of the Émile Leduc series. All of the novels are set in the various
areas of Paris, Paris.
Whatever it is. But she wrote published a standalone thriller this year in the spring called 3 Hours in Paris. And it is a stunningly fine thriller. I loved that book. So I can't recommend it too highly to everybody, highly enough to everybody.
Did you have any, we've been asking people this even in library land, because we have found with the current coronavirus crisis that some people are having trouble reading. Or some people are preferring to read what we sometimes refer to as comfort reads.
Yeah,
rereading authors,
yeah,
or rereading a series that you haven't explored for a long time, because it does bring that sense of warmth and comfort and consistency to your life in this current time.
And you're not going to be surprised. Changing. You know how it's going to play out.
Yeah. So have you read any of those that you'd like to brag about?
I'm sorry, what was that?
Have you read anything like that that you would like to brag about?
Oh, comfort reads. I don't read comfort reads. I watch comfort movies.
That's fine. People have been doing that as well.
But what I should have done was to go back and reread some of the stories that were important to me as a kid, because I can't think of anything more comfortable than the stories that made me want to be a storyteller. So I honestly, I had intended to go back and read The Count of Monte Cristo, which was the first. Can I tell it? Do we have time for me to tell?
Do we have time?
Story? Okay. I love telling this story when I do library events. Here it is. My father was a high school English teacher, and so he did his best to raise his children on literature with a capital L. But despite that, I haven't always been particularly judicious in my own choice of reading material. And that was especially true when I was an adolescent. That changed pretty dramatically in the summer that I was 13 years old, between my 6th grade and 7th grade year. I was a Boy Scout that summer, and I decided I was going to get my Reading Merit Badge. One of the requirements for the Reading Merit Badge, at least back then, was that you had to spend some time volunteering in your local library. I was living in a little town in Ohio at that point, so I went to the librarian, I made the arrangements, and when the time came, I showed up to do my duty. Now, this was long before they had computerized check-in and check-out. I'm sure you remember, Monique, and probably most of those people watching remembers that little pocket thing that used to be glued to the inside back cover of every book with the check-in slip inside.
Yep.
So what they did was they put me to work date stamping the returned books. They gave me this little black ink pad and a changeable rubber date stamp. And so for the first hour I was there, it was sort of ka-chunk, 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 ka-chunk. And after an hour, the librarian walked my way and proceeded to ask me a very librarian-esque question. She said, Kent, what do you like to read? Well, the honest to God truth was I like to read comic books at that point, but I didn't want to tell her that. So I briefly considered lying to her, but there was that whole "a scout is trustworthy" thing going on. So I told her the truth. And without batting an eye, she said to me, "Have you ever read The Count of Monte Cristo?" So I walked out of the library that day with that great Dumas classic under my arm, and I came back a few days later and checked out The Three Musketeers. And after that, it was The Man in the Iron Mask. And when I'd read everything that our little library had by Dumas, I asked her, what should I read next? And honest to God, Monique, she turned me on to H.G. Wells and Jules Verne and Arthur Conan Doyle and Jack London and Robert Louis Stevenson and all of these guys who wrote these great stories that were perfect for capturing a boy's heart. So first of all, God bless you, librarian, whoever you are, wherever you are now. Thank you for that guidance. And I had intended to go back and reread some of those books that made me fall in love with storytelling, but I haven't done that.
You are a very ambitious boy to walk off with a large size version. I've seen The Count of Monte Cristo. It is not thin. That was a very brave boy who did that. That's great because, yeah, I do believe Three Musketeers is a little bit smaller than that one. But yeah, no, that's great. People forget how those books, we call them classics now, but they were the comic and swashbuckling stories of their day.
They were pop culture.
Yeah, and how all of that was, and many of them, in some cases, were done in, not sure if Wells was or not. Doyle's was definitely where they were done in magazines, and and those weren't considered, decent things at the time. And now they're all old and staid and what have you. But that's not how they originally wrote them.
They are not dusty.
No. Okay, so here we have a rather personal question, and they made themselves anonymous for this one. They were intrigued by your introduction, which I do believe we got most of the facts off of your website. By the way, how'd you get kicked out of Sanford?
How are we doing on time here, Monique? Do we have time?
We're
for this
fine.
Okay, here's the story. I matriculated at Stanford University in the fall of 1969. And you may remember this was deep in the Vietnam conflict. Our nation was just tremendously divided. The nation, communities, families, that war divided us all. Stanford University at that point in time, you may remember that in the spring of 1970, Kent State happened. Mm-hmm. And we finally became aware that we were carrying on secret wars in Laos and Cambodia, and that the government had been lying to us. Stanford University at that point in time had a relationship with an organization called the Stanford Research Institute, SRI, whose primary source of income, at least that point in time, was research in military weaponry. And there were a lot of us at Stanford that felt that was an inappropriate relationship for an institution like Stanford to maintain, particularly at that point in history. So we petitioned the trustees to end the relationship, the administration. We marched, we did everything we could. And finally, in frustration, one day we marched into the administration building and we took it over. The president of the university at that point, a guy named Richard Lyman, was pretty reasonable. He said, "I'm not going to give you any problem," and he vacated the building. We took it over. That night at 8 o'clock, we invited a band to come in, and we held a dance where typically we would have been registering for our classes. At midnight, the band folded up and took off, and those of us who were going to occupy rolled out our sleeping bags and went to sleep. Big mistake. Because at 1 o'clock, the Palo Alto riot squad swept through and arrested us. I was on a full scholarship and my scholarship evaporated.
That's a pretty good story, though.
Yeah. I got to tell you, honestly, I have always thought across these years that it's far more interesting to say I was kicked out of Stanford than that I graduated from the place.
Apparently, it attracts interest more so. I'm trying to think if I have anything else in here. So what's next after this? Is your production schedule, so to speak, your book production schedule delayed due to COVID. I know a lot of authors have had release dates moved around all over the place, some till next year, some to even further. What's next on your plate, or what are you writing? And again, the other question is, that might be in production, but what are you writing now as well?
Yeah, so my release date has been postponed for my next novel until August of 2021. And that will be the next book in the Cork O'Connor series, number 18 in my Cork O'Connor series. I have one more novel in that series under contract, and I'm just about to launch into the writing of that. And then I'm going to turn my attention to my next standalone novel, which will be, I believe in its way, a companion novel to both Ordinary Grace and This Tender Land. So I know what I'm going to be working on for the next 3 or 4 years.
Okay, you've got a plan, even though it's not being plotted out.
Right.
Do you have any questions for the audience? Or what? I mean, I'm asking for the audience. We do have some other. I think I've answered everything that somebody's had in here. Storyboard. I'm sorry, I can't read and do this at the same time. And let's see. Yeah. Okay, I think we're almost done with the questions. We've enjoyed having you, definitely, and
Beautiful,
we've enjoyed.
I have to say,
coming.
Thank you so much. You have been so well prepared, and it's been such a pleasure working with you to make this.
Oh, well, thank you very much. I'm missing you in person because I am telling the audience that next time he's in town, you need to find out where Mr. Krueger is, because it's going to be a fun evening. And we wish it had been here, but maybe next time, and things will change as we ebb and flow like the river, so to speak. Yeah. What we're going to have for all the audience members out there is we have an attendance poll. That's what Zoom calls it, but it's kind of a poll just to see how you're viewing us tonight. And it gives us an idea on how to do programming for Zoom. So if you could please take that before leaving the scene, we would love it. Again, the novel is This Tender Land. We have multiple copies because we had to order more available. Our book discussions are going to be starting on the 24th. If you would like to see some of the other program that we're doing, we have it in our brochure that's throughout the library. If for some reason you cannot come into the library and you'd like us to have it through the drive-through, or have one of these, get a copy through the drive-through, or have the brochure through the drive-through, give us a call, let us know, and we will be able to do that for you as well. Again, thank you, Mr. Krueger, for being with us tonight and for writing this fantastic book with all these wonderful characters. Though I'm not quite sure if I'm going to forgive you for having one of the ladies of the night be Monique, but that's okay.
You know, I had forgotten that.
I kind of, well, you know, when you read your own name in a book, it pops out, and I'm like, wait a minute, there's a Monique in here, and I went, oh, okay.
It's such a lovely exotic name.
I thought it was great. It's used rarely in literature, so I think it was fun. But yeah, that was a bit of a surprise. But yeah, thanks for us. We'll look for your new stuff coming out. For those of you who want to tell your friends about this conversation, hopefully you do, we will be having, this has been recorded, and we will be getting it up into YouTube, and we will let everybody know, and we will let Mr. Krueger know so he can link to it as well on his website. And so there we are, and thanks for this evening. I'm trying to see if I'm doing anything else. Again, if you want a signed copy of This Tender Land, we do have editions at the Book Bin in Northbrook. Give them a call, and I think the link was in the Zoom request, or again, give us a call and we can contact you with them. And again, thank you, Mr. Krueger. Thanks for being here tonight, and thank you all for joining us. And this is the first event for Glenview Reads Together, and look for more, because we're going to be having some other Zoom discussions. One that should be really interesting, since Mr. Krueger went and was talking about a lot of the movie stars and what have you during the time period. I love the Buck Jones part. The Darlings of the 1930s is one of the programs that's coming up. So all those characters that we knew then and why they were so popular for the people at that time. Again, thank you. Good evening, and the signing off from the Glenview Public Library. Have a good evening, everybody. Bye-bye.